Good evening, and thank you for joining us on Digging the Bible Presents Ask the Archaeologist. I'm so happy that you're able to join us for this evening's program. And before we begin, just want to take a moment and bow our heads for a brief word of prayer. Lord, it's been a long week. Thank you for your protection. Please be with us as we enter this weekend and be with us through all of the natural disasters and curveballs that life throws us sometimes with all of the things that have been happening in this world. Be with those who seek you and be with us as we open your word. Now, amen. So, for this evening, we have a question that comes in from CM, and this question is about how long did it usually take to get from Egypt slash Sinai to the Promised Land? And then, in addition to that, the rest of the question was how long did it actually take them? So, when we turn to Exodus 13:17, it says, "And it came to pass when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God led them not through the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near." So, why would God take his people out of this land where they've been living for the past, 215 years, and then not let them go directly into the land of promise? The part of the reason was because they simply weren't ready to understand and accept that full promise and fully obey him. They had not been maintaining the way that he wanted them to live and represent him. And also, there were other individuals in the land at that particular time, and he wanted his people to trust him. And he was afraid that, hey, if they get into battle with the Philistines too soon, they might not like that very much and it will dishearten them. So instead, they took a different route. Now, the Bible does give us some clues about the route that they took. So if you turn to Numbers 33, verse 3, there is a whole list within chapter 33 of all of the locations where the children of Israel went during their times of wandering. But the very first thing that we need to know is where they left from. So in Numbers 33, verse 3, it says that they departed from Ramses on the first month, on the 15th day of the first month. So this is the day after the Passover lamb was slain. Pharaoh has kicked them out and they are leaving from the city of Ramses. That was the headquarters where potentially Joseph and Jacob had originally set up shop. And that is because Ramses is a later name for the city that was originally called Avaris and now is called Teladaba. So when you are looking at these cities, there's layers and layers and layers. By the time that we get to modern times, all of the cities have been buried, but at the time at which they're leaving, it was probably actually called Avaris, and Ramses was a updated notation from a later scribe or translator. But they are leaving from this city called Ramses. That is the main location where they've all gathered because they've known that this time was coming from the moment that Moses came back to Egypt. So here is a map, and this map is not to scale, but it gives you a general idea of the location of Ramses. So there was a main travel route that went up and down the Nile, lots of roads going all through the area. And then we have two main roads that we're going to be looking at. So we have a road that goes from On or Heliopolis, which we now know as suburbs of Cairo, and that road went up to the Avaris region or the region of Goshen. And then you have a southern road that goes to the tip of the Gulf of Suez, where it picks up another major highway that I will show you in a moment. But We have our two fingers of the Red Sea. We also have the stations in which they camped. So some of these are listed as plains, some of them are listed by mountain regions that they camped by. But we have in Numbers 33 a list of approximately 42 different locations where they spent this 40 years. And we know that two of those 40 years they were actually at Mount Sinai. Some locations that I do want to point out on this map. One we have right here next to the Gulf of Aqaba. This is Mount Sinai. We also have Zion Geber, or Zion Geber, as some people like to say. This is a very prominent location that we see coming into play during the days of the kings. King Solomon had a fleet of ships that they were building at this location. Then we have two locations here that we'll get to discuss in a moment, but I want to show you the ancient trade routes. These are the options that the Israelites had to exit Egypt. So the first option was called the Road by the Sea, and it went from the Ramses area, probably connecting to the ancient city of Ramses itself, where caravans would come in from the land of Canaan, follow along the coastal line, and then come into Ramses, where they would then continue down the Nile selling their goods, and goods from further down the Nile could travel up the Nile to Ramses, where they would then be shipped up to the more northern regions, either through the caravan or at any one of the numerous ports that were along the Mediterranean Sea. The second route was by the way of Shur. This one again, it left from Ramses, and you could travel a little further south across the Sinai Peninsula and then up through the middle of the land of Canaan. So this would be passing Hebron, Jerusalem, all of these cities that we're very familiar with in the Old Testament. And then eventually the road by the sea and the way of Shur would connect, and they would go further up towards Syria and Damascus. Then we have the third option. Now, the third option, there were two different launching points. So you could come from the city of Ramses down to the Gulf of Suez, or you could come from the city of On or Heliopolis, and you could meet there. From that point, there was a road that was very frequently traveled in the caravans, and it is known as the King's Highway. So the King's Highway would take you straight across the Sinai Peninsula to Zion Geber, and from there you could turn, you could go into Saudi Arabia, or you could go up through this little area here. This is known as Petra, currently in Jordan, and you would travel through the lands of Ammon and Moab and Edom, and you would come up, and eventually you would go north into Syria and Turkey. You could also go straight. There were some roads that went straight. One of these roads did lead into the Silk Road. There was travel that was going all up and down the Red Sea and the various gulfs. So there was a lot of travel that was going on. But the three main options that the Israelites had to flee was the road by the sea, the way of Shur, or the King's Highway. So we know for a fact that we can cross off the road by the sea because that went directly into the land of the Philistines. The Philistines tended to have some of their cities right along the coastline. And so the northern route, which this is sometimes called, was the one where it would have directly put them into contact with the Philistines rather quickly. The way of Shur didn't put them directly into those initial areas where the Philistines were gathered. However, it did go through land that was occupied by the Philistines and other people that had settled the land of Canaan. So again, with both of these options, they were going to come into potential conflict rather soon after leaving Egypt. And that wasn't something that God thought that they were prepared for at this moment, which leaves the King's Highway. And this is probably the route that Moses was very, very familiar with, because it is most likely the route that he took when he was fleeing Egypt and he went across the Sinai Peninsula into the land of Midian. If you go to Deuteronomy 1:2, Moses actually tells us approximately how long the journey was. So if you go to Deuteronomy 1:2, it says, there are 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir unto Kadesh Barnea. So if you are looking at a map, you're like, okay, well, we have some locations here. We need to know approximately how far apart they are in miles so that we can determine how fast Moses was assuming that a standard person could journey per day. If you go to Exodus 2:15 and Exodus 3:1, we learn that Horeb is just another name for the mountain of God, which is Mount Sinai. So if you are looking at Horeb or Mount Sinai, which we have marked on our map right here, Moses is telling you that it is an 11-day journey from Mount Sinai to Kadesh. Now, most people assume that Kadesh is actually what we now call Petra, but there is another location that seems to actually fit a little better, and that is this location right over here that's marked by this question mark. This is one of the areas that they haven't been able to identify specifically the city that would or could be known as Kadesh. Today, it's an area called El Cades Spring, and it is in a river basin or a wadi basin in that region. And at one point, it was actually used to mark the boundaries of the land of Canaan. So if you are looking at, say, Petra, we can find that it is approximately 125 to 140 miles as the crow flies to either location. But walking to Petra from Mount Sinai, it's more like somewhere around 172 to 217 miles. It just depends on the route that you take. If you're going to take, the roads this way, or if you're going to take roads that are this way. So if you average it out, it averages about 15 to 20 miles per day. If you look at the roads that go to El Cade Spring, then you're talking somewhere around 221 miles ish, because we know that they didn't cross the Red Sea again. So the current roads, they would have had to come this way and then across like this, or they would have had to come this way and then go south just a tad to catch another road that would lead them up into this region. So either way you look at it, they were traveling on average, just Moses is saying it's an 11 days journey, as if he is talking to a standard, group of people, not people that are fleeing anywhere, just an average travel speed of somewhere between 15 and 20 miles per day. Now, if we compare that to what we know of some of the travels from wagon trains out west, that actually does match what we are getting the information from those records of how fast a wagon train would travel, somewhere around 2 to 3 miles per hour, more along the lines of 2 miles per hour, depending on how many people were there. So if we are looking at, an 11-day journey and we're taking somewhere around, 172 to 220 miles, it's going to be somewhere around 15 to 20 miles a day. And that would put you walking, 10 hours a day, which there's during a spring, summerish time frame, you do have that much light. We do know that at Petra, there was an oasis as we are looking. So This would have been the Nabateans built this. It's the Treasury Building. Probably very, very familiar with this particular location. It has made its way into a number of movies, shows, media. Everybody wants to go see the Treasury Building. And this is what Petra is most famous for. But they actually, when you do some of the archaeological research there, they had pipes that would run from other locations to this city so that they did have water there. It is an ancient city beyond the 100 BC date, so it does go further back. If you look in 2 Kings 14:7, it's believed that this was a city that was called Sela or Sela, and it's possibly, like I said, the original name of Kadesh. If you are looking a little further west, so this right above Wadi Musa, this is the location of Petra. If you go a little further west, this is the other region with the El Cades Spring location that they're thinking that it might be one of the tells around this particular area. And you'll notice that there is the current border of Israel is right here. So it is just over the border in Egypt, actually. But what's really interesting about this location is that this border here is not the original border according to biblical standards of where the land of Canaan ended. The land of Canaan actually ended at this place called the river or the brook of Egypt, which some people think is the Nile River, but actually is this little river right here. It's not that little, it's about over 150 miles in length, and it does have a river basin. We can read about the brook of Egypt in Genesis 15:18, and this is the Wadi el Arish. Now, this river basin, if we zoom out, so here's the river itself. This would have been the ancient border of Egypt. It followed along here, and then along the eastern edge of this border down to Izan Giber would have been where the ancient Egyptian fortresses and protection strongholds were. And that would have been the boundary line for ancient Egypt. So sending them to a Kadesh that would be located, in this region would have placed them outside of the bounds of Egypt or Egypt at that time compared to the Egypt that we currently know whose boundary is right here. So he would not have been sending them back into Egypt. They would have still been far out of it. So the two locations for Kadesh could be either here or here. But this Wadi El Arish did have a very large basin, and you can see the waterways all through this area. So they would have had a lot of access to water if they had stayed in the Sinai Peninsula. But because this was the boundary for Egypt and they left Egypt, they didn't have access to any of this. This is also some of the regions where they were going through and they were actually mining. We can find some of their mines over here. Down here is the traditional Mount Sinai, which we know is incorrect. We've discussed that on the program before. But there's no evidence of any wanderings that were going on in this particular region. A lot of people think that this is where they spent their time wandering in the wilderness, and there's actually no evidence for that in any of these locations, and especially with the fact that this was all under Egyptian control. So going back to our original question of, how long should it have taken them? Well, at 150 miles ish across the northern route, if they were traveling day and night, it should have taken them at most, 7.5 days to get to the boundary line. And I've got the boundary line here just past the questionable area of Kadesh along that route that I was just showing you with the water basin here. Um, Same thing if they had made it, across the Sinai Peninsula here, it's approximately the same distance, just over 150-ish miles from the Gulf of Suez to this point. It should not have taken them more than a week to be able to enter the land of Canaan. Now, going to Sinai, so, it was an 11-day journey from here to here or from here to here. So we're talking if they left in the middle of April, which it appears that they did, they should have been in the land of Canaan no later than August, with traveling across the Sinai Peninsula, going down to Mount Sinai, spending 40 days in Sinai, where they received the Ten Commandments, and then traveling the 11 days back up into the land of Canaan. It should not have taken them more than just a couple of months, sitting there just waiting to be able to enter. If they had taken the northern route, like I said, it would have only been a week if they hadn't, gone down into the Sinai area. But instead, what we are seeing is we are seeing uh, that they didn't listen. They got to Kadesh. They sent the spies in. They were there. They were within the boundaries, and they simply didn't believe and didn't have enough faith to be able to go in. They almost killed Joshua over their lack of faith. That is how afraid they were and how unbelieving. And so then they were turned again back down, and they actually spent their time wandering at these locations, all in this region here. Then, as they get closer to the end of the wandering time, they make their way up the King's Highway. And this is where we see them ask the Edomites if they can come through the land and take the highway. This was not something that was unusual. The King's Highway was used by everybody. They were trying to be nice because they were such a large group of them. We're not talking a small caravan of, 50 to 300-ish people. We are talking millions of people. So they knew that it would be a strain on the resources of these areas. And so they offered to make sure that it would not be troublesome. But they were denied, and then the same thing happened further up. So they ended up following, or they were attempting to follow, the King's Highway further north. And then this cluster of trees here are the plains of Moab, where Moses's journey ended and where their wanderings ended. And then they ended up crossing and going over into the promised land here. So while it should have taken 7-day journey, we'll extend it. We'll say 2-week journey if they were moving slowly, very, very slowly. And they turned that 2-week journey into something that was 40 years of wandering. So I do hope that that answers your question, CM, on how long it should have taken them and how long it actually took them. Now, this is a live program, so we do have some time left over for questions this evening. So if anybody has any questions at all, now would be the time to submit those into the chat box. If you have a question later on, you're watching this on replay, then you can again submit them into the comment section, or you can visit our website, diggingyourbible.com. There is a place where you can submit questions on there, or you can drop us a comment on any of our social medias. Also want to point out that we are now doing weekly quizzes on our YouTube channel. So this week's quiz was, who was the first king of Israel? So head on over to our comments in our post section on our YouTube channel and see if you can answer the question of who was the first king of Israel. So we do have a question. Let's look at this question as it came in. Get that popped up on the screen here. So the question is coming in from Heaven Soon, and Heaven Soon is asking, once they left Mount Sinai, their next stop was how many miles away? Now, that is a good question because there's a great number of locations that are talked about when we are looking at the Bible. I had them on the screen. Let's pull those up. Um, so we have where they camped by the sea, and they went into the wilderness of Sin, and they got into Sinai. Some of these locations, because so many people have identified the wilderness of Sinai as this location over here near St. Catherine's. And let me get the comment down so people can see. So, because these locations here have been identified potentially over in the Sinai Peninsula, they're picking locations and saying, we think this is where they would have been based on, how quickly we're assuming that they traveled and the direction that they traveled. And, we might find some evidence of human occupation here. It doesn't really match, but, hey, let's go with that. Because of those types of things, it's difficult to determine exactly how many miles they went or how many days they went. You'd have to go back through the book of Numbers and Deuteronomy and even Exodus and Leviticus to see exactly where each location potentially resides, and then see if there's archaeological evidence at these potential locations. And because Saudi Arabia has not been opened for a lot of exploration until recently, and because biblical archaeology is something that a lot of people in the Near East, there's a lot of political tensions. So it's not always something that is welcomed with open arms. So you have to pay mind of those types of things that have existed and rely on previous work that has been done in these areas and research. There's some excellent research that was done during the mid 1800s where there were individuals that went over and examined some of these locations and marked down ancient town names and ancient research. And those are wonderful resources to look at to see, what they were thinking at that particular time. Now, are those records always correct? No. But it's nice to have some of those records with some of the original names or some of the older versions of the names, because those names have since changed in some cases. So, a lot of just identifying locations is tracking, what was this place called after its name was changed. And that is a tremendous amount of tracking and record keeping. And if you can actually maintain a list of those names, it does help in research. But as to the question of how many miles away, I am not certain, but it is something that I will look into, and we'll try to have an answer for you next week. All right, so our next questions is, if we go with a Saudi Arabia site, what was the next stop after Mount Sinai? So we don't have to go with the Saudi Arabia site or not, because the Bible lists the next location. It would be location number 13 right here. So if we are looking, in Leviticus, and I I don't want to say the name because I know that I will mispronounce it. So I'm just going to go with location number 13 here with Kybroth, and leave it at that. But that's the location where they went next. And if you're reading, there is a slight difference in locations if you're comparing Numbers 33 to the travels in Deuteronomy. And that is because if you're looking at Deuteronomy, Moses was giving a summary of, the past 40 years. It had been a long time. All of the older generation had passed. And so he is now talking to the younger generation. If we look, one of the interesting points is it tells us that Aaron actually he passed away on the first day of the fifth month, is when Aaron passed away at Mount Horeb. And from there, we find that Moses is writing Deuteronomy. So if you go to Numbers 33, verses 38 and 39, that's where we find when Aaron died. So Aaron died in the 40th year, the first day of the fifth month. If you go to Deuteronomy, Moses is giving his final speeches, and they're on the plains at Moab. And he is giving this speech on the first day of the 11th month of the 40th year. So it's been fifth month, sixth month, seventh month, eighth month, ninth, 10th, 11th. So it's 6 months after Aaron has died, and they're getting ready to go into the land of promise. And they've made a number of stops between when Aaron um, was buried at Mount Hor on number 34. And we come all the way down here to 42. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different locations that they were camping at in only 6 months. And in one of these places, it's actually talking about how they were so numerous that they're taking up the distance between from one town to the next town, and they're kind of camped between the two towns, and those were the borders of where they're camped because there were so many individuals. And that's also something that we see over here when they first entered into the land of Midian, where they were so numerous that some of them were still camped by the Red Sea, while another group of them were camped at a town further inland. And it was simply because the area that they had available to them, it was like a long rectangle where they were just spread out between these different towns and locations because there were so many. And then they would get to locations like the plains of Moab or Mount Sinai, where they were actually able to stretch out into more of the square cross formation. Another question: did they change campsites because of the strain on the resources from that amount of people? Do you think that is why God moved them to the next site? Probably because it wasn't just the people that we're talking about here. Remember, they brought all of their animals with them. So we are talking, if we have, 3.5 million people that are wandering the wilderness here, we also have millions of cattle and sheep and goats and whatever other animals that they brought along the trail with them. So we've got a lot of strain on all of the resources. So yes, they could be changing these locations simply because of the strain on the resources. And if we look, Jacob and his family, they actually resided more of had that home base, and then they did a circuit where they would take the animals on this circuit and go from location to location to location. And Joseph goes to the one location. They're like, oh no, they moved on. They're at Dothan and go here and go there. And so Joseph is following along that circuit in which they took the animals. So I imagine that they may have been doing something similar. And, they've got 34 locations in 38 years. Or I'm sorry, 40 years. And, they made potentially 12 locations by the time that they get to Mount Sinai. So they weren't moving quite as frequently in some cases, and in other cases it was just move, 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 move. And some of those let's move very quickly is because there were some struggles with the local population, and in some cases they were told, you know what, just turn the other cheek, keep walking, keep moving on, because this land belongs to, say, Edom. It belongs to the descendants of Esau. You're not allowed to touch them. So just ignore them, move on. Whereas other locations, such as when they got to King Og's people, they were told, okay, you know what, their cup is full, and therefore this land, it was never promised to them. They're very evil. This land was promised to you. Go to, and we see the tribes of Reuben and Manasseh, and they were able to, the whole group was able to conquer these tribes that were further north, and Reuben and Manasseh were able to actually settle those regions before they crossed over in the Jordan and went into the main area that most people know as the land of promise. But the land of promise actually extended a little bit beyond what people typically think of as these small boundaries. Do we have any other questions for this evening? Now, remember, we will be talking about our quiz from this past week next week. So if you want to visit the YouTube channel, look at the post. First King of Israel. Get your question or get your guesses in, and we will be discussing the correct answer and the other options that were available during next week's program. And then we will also be posting another quiz this week. So you'll have some time to answer the question from this week's quiz. I don't see any other questions coming in for this evening. So we will go ahead and close and just pray that the Lord be with you, that the Lord be with everything that's happening with the world. We know that there's a lot of things that we just don't find pleasant and that are happening around us. We were told that these things must happen. So just pray that God will keep us under his wings and protect us, and join us again next Friday night for Ask the Archaeologist. Thank you and have a good one.